On a quiet night, a police officer pulls over a black woman, accusing her of resisting arrest. His testimony is strong, his confidence unshaken. But there's one thing he doesn't know. She's a high-ranking Navy SEAL, trained to handle far greater threats than him. What happens when the truth comes out? Will justice prevail, or will the system protect its own? Stay tuned to find out. And don't forget to subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as spectators filled the wooden benches, eager to witness the trial that had gripped the city. Journalists clutched their notepads, cameras flashed, and local activists whispered among themselves. At the center of it all, Camille Brooks sat at the defendant's table, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. Dressed in a navy blue blazer and crisp white blouse, she exuded quiet confidence. Yet, the weight of the accusations against her loomed over the room like a storm waiting to break. On the other side of the courtroom, Officer Mark Reynolds sat with an air of smug certainty, his police uniform perfectly pressed, his expression calm. He had played this game before. He knew how these cases went. A white cop's word against a black woman's? The outcome seemed obvious. Judge William Carter, a no-nonsense man in his 60s, with deep-set eyes and graying hair, entered the room. "Court is now in session," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of decades on the bench. The bailiff stepped forward. "State versus Camille Brooks," he read aloud. The name echoed through the chamber. Camille inhaled deeply, but showed no sign of nerves. Her attorney, Jordan Pierce, leaned in. "Stay steady, Camille," he whispered. "We'll get through this." She gave a small nod. Her dark brown eyes locked on the judge. The prosecutor, Richard Avery, stood, adjusting his expensive navy suit. "Your Honor, the prosecution is prepared to present overwhelming evidence proving that the defendant, Miss Brooks, resisted arrest and physically assaulted Officer Reynolds during a routine stop." Reynolds sat back in his chair, a slight smirk playing at the corner of his lips. Judge Carter turned his gaze to Camille. "Miss Brooks, do you understand the charges against you?" "Yes, Your Honor," Camille replied evenly. "Do you wish to make a statement before we proceed?" Camille glanced briefly at Reynolds before turning back to the judge. Her voice was calm, deliberate. "I do, Your Honor," she said, "because the story you've heard so far is a lie." A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. Officer Reynolds stiffened, his smirk fading slightly. Judge Carter narrowed his eyes. "Then, let's get to the truth." The night air was thick and humid as Camille Brooks drove through the quiet streets of Atlanta, Georgia. She had just left a charity gala, still dressed in a sleek navy dress, her heels neatly placed in the passenger seat beside her. The glow of streetlights flickered past as she checked her GPS for the fastest route home. Then, the flash of red and blue lights filled her rearview mirror. Camille sighed, pulling over to the side of the road. She had done nothing wrong, yet experience had taught her that these stops rarely ended in a simple warning. A figure approached her window, flashlight shining directly in her face. "License and registration," the officer demanded. His tone was sharp, authoritative. Camille squinted through the blinding light, but kept her voice steady. "Good evening, officer. Can I ask why I was pulled over?" The man shifted, lowering the flashlight just enough for her to see his face. "Officer Mark Reynolds." "You were driving suspiciously," he replied flatly. Camille frowned. "Suspiciously? I was driving the speed limit." "Step out of the vehicle," Reynolds ordered, ignoring her response. Camille hesitated. "With all due respect, officer, I'd like to understand why I need to step out. I haven't violated any laws." Reynolds let out a frustrated sigh, and gripped his belt. "Are you refusing to comply?" Camille could feel the situation shifting. Years of training had taught her how to read people. Reynolds was itching for confrontation. She reached for her glove compartment, moving slowly and deliberately. "I'm getting my registration," she said, her voice calm. But before she could grab it, Reynolds yanked the door open. "Out, now!" A sharp jolt of adrenaline shot through Camille's body, but she suppressed it. She knew better than to resist. Slowly she stepped out, her hands visible. The moment her feet hit the pavement, Reynolds grabbed her wrist. "Hey! There's no need for that," she protested, twisting slightly to break his grip. Reynolds' grip tightened. "Stop resisting." "I'm not resisting," Camille said firmly. Reynolds pulled her arm behind her back, forcing her forward against the hood of her car. The metal was hot against her skin. "I said, stop moving," Reynolds barked, pressing harder. "This is unnecessary," Camille gritted out, her voice tight but controlled. And then, the lie that would later echo in a courtroom. "Not, she just went for my gun," Reynolds shouted. A surge of movement. A radio crackled, requesting backup. "Suspect attempted to disarm me." Camille's head snapped up. "That's a lie," she gasped. But it didn't matter. She already knew how this would play out. The weight of Reynolds' knee pressed against her back, as she felt the cold steel of handcuffs snap around her wrists. Lying on the hood of her own car, Camille Brooks stared into the darkness, knowing her real fight had just begun. The courtroom was silent, except for the occasional scribble of a reporter's pen and the hushed murmurs of the spectators. Camille Brooks sat motionless at the defense table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Across from her, Officer Mark Reynolds lounged in his chair, his confidence palpable. The trial had only just begun, but he already looked like a man who thought he had won. Jordan Pierce, Camille's attorney, stood and adjusted his tie before stepping forward. He was young, fresh out of law school, but determined. His eyes flickered toward Camille before addressing the judge. "Your Honor, the defense is ready to proceed," he announced. Judge William Carter, his sharp gaze shifting between the two parties, gave a slow nod. "Very well. Prosecution, you may call your first witness." Richard Avery, the lead prosecutor, stood with a smug expression. He was seasoned, confident, and skilled in making juries see what he wanted them to see. "The state calls Officer Mark Reynolds to the stand." Reynolds stood, straightening his uniform as he strode to the witness stand. He moved deliberately, pausing just long enough to look at the jury, as if reassuring them of his authority. He took his oath and sat, leaning slightly forward, ready to perform. "Officer Reynolds," Avery began, pacing in front of the jury. "Please describe the events of the night in question." Reynolds cleared his throat, his voice steady. "I was patrolling near the East Side District when I noticed a black sedan circling the neighborhood. It was late, and the area had seen a rise in burglaries. I pulled the vehicle over to conduct a routine check." Jordan stiffened at the defense table. Circling the neighborhood? That was a blatant misrepresentation. Camille had simply been driving home. "And what happened when you approached the vehicle?" Avery prompted. Reynolds sighed dramatically. "I asked the driver, Miss Brooks, for her license and registration, but she immediately became defensive, questioning my authority." Camille's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. "She refused to comply," Reynolds continued, shaking his head. "When I asked her to step out of the vehicle, she resisted. As I attempted to de-escalate, she lunged toward my firearm. I had no choice but to subdue her." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Jordan shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. That is a complete misrepresentation of events. Judge Carter held up a hand. You'll have your chance for cross-examination, Mr. Pierce. Continue, Mr. Avery. Avery smirked before turning back to Reynolds. Did you feel your life was in danger? Reynolds exhaled dramatically. Absolutely. She was aggressive, unpredictable. I had to act quickly. Jordan glanced at Camille, whose face remained unreadable. But he knew what she was thinking. Let him talk. Let him dig his own grave. The air in the courtroom was heavy with tension as Officer Mark Reynolds stepped down from the witness stand, his testimony painting Camille Brooks as a violent and dangerous woman. The smirk on his face grew as he returned to his seat, clearly believing he had just solidified his case. His fellow officers sitting in the back row exchanged satisfied glances, but Camille remained composed. She had been through worse battles before. Jordan Pierce, her attorney, rose from his chair. Your Honor, the defense would like to call the defendant, Camille Brooks, to the stand. The murmur of the crowd intensified. The accused taking the stand was always a gamble. But Camille wasn't just any defendant. Judge Carter adjusted his glasses. Proceed. Camille stood with measured grace, smoothing her navy blazer, before stepping toward the witness stand. The jury watched her closely, some with skepticism, others with curiosity. She took the oath, her voice unwavering. Miss Brooks, Jordan began, his voice steady. You've heard Officer Reynolds' testimony. According to him, you were aggressive, non-compliant, and attempted to reach for his weapon. Are these claims true? Camille met Jordan's gaze before turning to the jury. No, they are not. Jordan nodded. Then tell us, in your own words, what happened that night. Camille exhaled slowly, gathering her thoughts. I was driving home after a charity event when Officer Reynolds pulled me over. I wasn't speeding. I wasn't swerving. There was no reason for the stop. When I asked him why he pulled me over, he refused to give a direct answer. She paused, letting her words sink in. When he asked for my license and registration, I told him I'd retrieve them from my glove compartment. But before I could reach, he ordered me out of the vehicle. Jordan stepped closer. And did you comply? I hesitated, Camille admitted, because I wanted to understand why I was being asked to step out. But I wasn't aggressive. I wasn't threatening. I simply asked a question. Jordan turned to the jury. And what happened next? Camille's jaw tightened slightly. He grabbed my arm. When I instinctively tried to pull back, he forced me onto the hood of my car. I told him I wasn't resisting, but he kept saying I was. Her eyes swept over the jury. And then, he made the accusation that changed everything. He shouted that I was reaching for his gun. A ripple of gasps echoed through the room. Jordan let the moment breathe before continuing. Miss Brooks, are you trained in combat? The courtroom fell silent. Camille's expression didn't change. Yes, I am. Jordan paced slowly. Tell the court about your background. Camille sat up straighter. I served in the United States Navy for 20 years. Jordan nodded. And what was your rank upon leaving service? A pause. Then Camille lifted her chin and spoke clearly. Lieutenant Commander, Navy SEAL. The courtroom exploded. Gasps, murmurs, even an audible "no way" from the gallery. Judge Carter banged his gavel. Order! I will have order in this courtroom. Across the room, Officer Reynolds had gone rigid, his face draining of color. The smirk was gone. Jordan turned back to Camille, his voice even. Miss Brooks, as a Navy SEAL, were you trained to disarm opponents? Camille's eyes locked onto Reynolds. Yes. If you had truly wanted to take Officer Reynolds' weapon, would you have succeeded? Her answer was simple. Yes. The silence that followed was deafening. The courtroom was frozen in silence. Officer Mark Reynolds sat stiffly at the prosecution's table, his previously smug expression wiped clean. The revelation that Camille Brooks was a lieutenant commander and former Navy SEAL had sent shockwaves through the room. The jury exchanged glances, some looking stunned, others suddenly unsure of what they had believed just moments ago. Richard Avery, the prosecutor, cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Miss Brooks," he said, forcing a tight smile. "That's an impressive background, but it doesn't change the fact that Officer Reynolds stated you attempted to reach for his weapon." Camille tilted her head slightly. "With all due respect, counselor, it changes everything." Avery's smile faltered. "How so?" "Because if I had truly attempted to disarm Officer Reynolds," Camille said evenly, "I would have succeeded." A murmur rippled through the audience. Jordan Pierce, her attorney, stepped forward. "Miss Brooks, based on your training, what do you believe happened that night?" Camille exhaled. "I believe Officer Reynolds was looking for a reason to escalate. I didn't resist. I didn't reach for his gun. But he needed justification for his actions, so he created a narrative that made me the aggressor." Avery scoffed. "That's speculation." "Is it?" Jordan countered. "Or is it a pattern?" He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the defense would like to submit new evidence." Judge Carter frowned. "Proceed." Jordan walked to the evidence table and picked up a folder. "Contained in this file are multiple complaints against Officer Reynolds for excessive force, most of them targeting black civilians." Gasps erupted throughout the courtroom. "Objection!" Avery shot to his feet. "Irrelevant." Judge Carter flipped through the pages Jordan had handed him. His frown deepened. "Overruled. The jury will review this." Reynolds visibly clenched his jaw, his fingers digging into the arms of his chair. Jordan turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you just heard Officer Reynolds claim my client was violent, aggressive, and a threat. But the truth is, he's said the same thing about numerous others before her. Time and time again, these reports have been buried or ignored. But not today." Avery tried to recover. "Even if previous complaints exist, that does not prove Miss Brooks was innocent that night." Jordan smiled. "You're right. But this does." He lifted a USB drive. "The defense has obtained cell phone footage from a bystander at the scene." The courtroom erupted once more. Judge Carter banged his gavel. "Bailiff, play the video." The screen flickered to life. The footage was shaky, taken from a low angle inside a parked car. But the audio was crystal clear. "Stop resisting," Reynolds' voice barked. "I'm not resisting," Camille's voice countered, calm and firm. Then came the most damning words of all. "Women like you need to learn your place." The air was sucked out of the room. Reynolds' face turned pale. His hands, which had been gripping the table, were now trembling. For the first time he knew, he was losing. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as the video ended. The words, "Women like you need to learn your place," echoed in the minds of the jurors, the spectators, and most importantly, Officer Mark Reynolds. His once confident posture had collapsed, his face a shade paler than before. Judge Carter cleared his throat, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Pierce, do you have anything further?" Jordan Pierce shook his head. "No, Your Honor. The defense rests." The judge turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard the evidence. You will now deliberate." The jury was dismissed, and the room remained thick with tension. Camille sat quietly at the defense table, her hands folded. Despite the overwhelming evidence in her favor, she knew better than to assume victory. Justice was not always guaranteed, especially for people like her. Minutes stretched into hours. The courtroom buzzed with hushed conversations as everyone awaited the jury's decision. Finally, the door opened, and the bailiff announced, "The jury has reached a verdict." Everyone took their seats. Camille inhaled deeply, but kept her face unreadable. The forewoman, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, stood and unfolded a piece of paper. "In the case of State versus Camille Brooks, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty on all charges." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Camille exhaled slowly, her body finally relaxing. Jordan squeezed her arm in relief. The forewoman continued, "Furthermore, we strongly recommend an investigation into Officer Reynolds' conduct." Judge Carter nodded solemnly. "The court will take that recommendation under advisement." His gaze shifted to Reynolds. "Officer Reynolds, I suggest you retain counsel. This matter is far from over." Reynolds opened his mouth as if to protest, but no words came. His colleagues, once so certain in their support, avoided his gaze. He wasn't just losing the case, he was losing everything. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed. Camille, now free, stood tall, her expression calm but firm. A reporter pushed forward. "Miss Brooks, what do you have to say after today's ruling?" Camille met the camera's gaze. "This isn't just about me. It's about accountability, about justice, and about making sure this never happens to anyone else again." She turned and walked away, leaving the cameras and her fight for justice far from over. Months had passed since the trial, but the impact of Camille Brooks versus Officer Mark Reynolds was far from over. The case had made national headlines, sparking debates about police accountability, racial profiling, and abuse of power. Officer Reynolds was dismissed from the police force following an internal investigation. Additional complaints surfaced, stories of harassment, fabricated charges, and racial bias. He was later indicted for perjury and misconduct. The same system that once protected him had finally turned against him. As for Camille, she had no interest in fame. She had spent years fighting battles in foreign war zones, but now she was fighting a different war, one at home. Standing before a crowd at a community event in Atlanta, she adjusted the microphone, scanning the faces of those gathered. Some were activists, some were victims of similar injustice, and others were simply there to listen. "I didn't ask to be a symbol," Camille said, her voice calm but commanding. "I didn't ask for any of this. But when injustice finds you, you have two choices: accept it or stand against it." A pause. The crowd listened intently. "I spent my life serving this country, believing in justice. That night, Officer Reynolds thought he could take my dignity. He thought I was just another person he could silence." She looked directly at the cameras. "But I am not easy to silence." Applause erupted. As she stepped down from the stage, Jordan Pierce approached. "You know, Camille, you could go back to your old life now." She smirked. "You think that fight was the last one?" Jordan chuckled. "Didn't think so. The fight wasn't over. And Camille Brooks wasn't done." Camille Brooks's story is more than just a courtroom drama. It's a wake-up call. It reminds us that injustice thrives when good people remain silent. Whether it's in law enforcement, the workplace, or daily interactions, bias and abuse of power exist, and it takes courage to challenge them. One key takeaway from Camille's fight is the importance of knowing your rights. She remained calm, asked the right questions, and understood the legal implications of her actions. In real life, we should do the same. Educate ourselves on our rights during police encounters, workplace discrimination, or any situation where power is misused. Another lesson is the power of truth and perseverance. Camille refused to be intimidated, and her resilience exposed a corrupt system. This teaches us that even when the odds seem stacked against us, standing firm in the truth can bring change. Finally, the story highlights the need for accountability. Justice is not just about one case. It's about ensuring lasting reform. We must demand better from our institutions, hold people accountable, and support those fighting for fairness. Camille didn't win alone. She had a lawyer, evidence, and community support. Change happens when we stand together.